Welcome to the Free Will Show, a podcast that provides a beginner-friendly introduction to free will while also exploring cutting-edge developments on the topic. I'm Taylor Sear.
And I'm Matt Flummer. In this episode, we talk with Justin Caouette about a variety of topics he's interested in the free will debate, as well as what is at stake in the debate itself.
Thanks for listening. I'm happy to introduce Justin Caouette, assistant professor at Bridgewater State University and part-time teacher at Northeastern University, Rutgers, and University of Massachusetts, Dartmouth. Justin is the author of several articles and book chapters on free will, moral responsibility, and moral psychology. And he's the co-editor of two books, one on the moral psychology of compassion and the other on free will and moral responsibility. The latter volume was published in 2013 by Cambridge Scholars, and it features original essays by a lot of philosophers who have been guests on this podcast. So listeners may be interested in picking that book up. Welcome to the show, Justin. Can you start by telling us a bit about yourself, your work, and how you came to be interested in working on issues related to free will?
Absolutely. Thanks for having me, guys. I'm a big fan of the show.
Well, thanks.
So, as you mentioned, I teach a lot. Right now, I'm teaching 11 classes this semester.
Oh, wow.
Goodness.
Most of the courses I teach are in applied ethics and critical thinking. Once in a while, I get the opportunity to teach a class on free will or an upper-level social political class where I get to teach some of my stuff. I got a bunch of different philosophical interests. I've been working on the ethics of pharmacological enhancement. Like, when is it morally permissible to take a drug to accomplish a goal? That was kind of some of the work I did when I was at the University of Calgary, and I've just been continuing to do that. A talk coming up in February at the U.S. Naval College on a soldier's obligation to enhance, whether or not they have one. But with regards to free will, lately I've been thinking about punishment. I've been trying to develop an idea that I call reasonable retributivism. I've been working on a lot of issues related to the moral emotions. And it's all part of like a bigger project I have on free will, which is, I guess if I had to throw a title on it, it'd be Free Will and Why It Matters. It's a lot like Keynes' 96, The Significance of Free Will, and maybe even Perboom's 2001, Living Without Free Will. And so I see myself as kind of entering that debate, and I'm pretty much responding to what I call optimistic free will skeptics. So these are the free will skeptics that say, we don't have free will and it's probably a good thing. So here's like the Perbooms and the Carusos of the world. I see myself as kind of always thinking about concepts and whether those moral concepts are connected to free will in any interesting way.
Cool.
Very cool.
One of your projects aims to show that the question of whether or not we have free will matters, as you just said. So what all do you think is riding on the answer to this question?
And to put it bluntly, I think a lot is riding on the free will question. It started for me when I was thinking about moral psychology. So I was a psych undergrad. And so as an undergrad, I was thinking about questions related to psychopathy and schizophrenia and anxiety disorders and addiction. I come from a place where addiction is rampant. And so I have a lot of friends that have struggled with addiction. And so I would find myself getting angry at some of the ways that they would act. And then I felt like, wait, I don't know if that anger is warranted or not. And so I started to delve into the philosophical literature on responsibility of addicts and responsibility of psychopaths. And that's kind of how I entered the fray. And so for me, it's how we treat people matters. And if they're not the way that we think they are, then I don't think we're warranted in treating them a particular way. And so if we think they're free, I think that's really underlying lots of the way that we respond to other people. We just assume that they have this choice and we act accordingly. And so if it turns out we don't have free will, then I really believe that the way that we respond to people needs to change. It's really hard to comprehend, to be honest with you, what that word would look like.
Right. Yeah, it's interesting that you mentioned the Robert Cain book, because in our very first episode where we were talking about like why we should care about free will, introducing free will, we mentioned that book and talked about some of the things that Cain identifies as important or closely related to free will, why we might take it to be important. And yeah, our ordinary practices of holding each other accountable is up there for a lot of philosophers. Here's why free will is important for moral responsibility. I'm curious, do you think there are any other things that matter to us that depend on free will? We mentioned things, it's been a while. It's been years now, Matt. Like
I know we mentioned things like creativity and love.
Yeah. And maybe autonomy. I don't know if you had thoughts on some of those other things.
Yeah. And so building on that, I think Justin Caouette, I think it was, he wrote some stuff on free will and love as well, kind of like reviving some of that work that Cain initially did. And so, yeah, I think nearly all of our moral emotions rely on it. And I think moral obligation itself relies on a certain conception of freedom. So I think moral obligation, forgiveness, love, the criminal justice system, different aspects of the criminal justice system, mens rea. I think there are lots of concepts that require or assume a certain kind of freedom. And so what I guess one way you can think about the project that I'm trying to put forward is that I'm trying to what I call raise the stakes in the free will debate. And so I worked with this epistemologist when I was at the University of Calgary, Jeremy Fantle. He's just a really smart guy, and I learned a lot from him about the epistemic justification literature. And so him and Matt McGrath put forward this view in epistemology called pragmatic encroachment. And so, they believe that, and it's from their 2002 and a 2007 paper mostly, and then they came out with a book in 2009. But their view is that there are pragmatic considerations to knowledge. So to make a knowledge claim, that depends partly on what's at stake in that particular context. Depending on the context. So if it's a high stakes type case, or if there's a lot riding on a particular belief, then the evidence that you need to kind of make that claim goes up. Yeah. And so what I see myself doing is in questioning the connection between free will and moral obligation. And obviously moral responsibility is one that people often talk about, but love, forgiveness, the criminal justice system, as we kind of add every moral concept to that conversation, the stakes go up, so to speak, in the free will debate. And so what I think I'm doing is raising the stakes such that the free will skeptic doesn't have the evidence to say that we do not have free will, because many of the skeptics themselves admit that libertarian free will in different forms is plausible, even though unlikely. I think that's the route that Perboom goes when he talks about agent causation, and Caruso makes similar claims on that as well. And so yeah, I think that by raising the stakes in these debates, it makes it so that the skeptic really can't say much, or they can't make the claim that we don't have free will.
Can it work the other way around too? So in raising the stakes, you also kind of play into the hand of the skeptic in some sense, where it takes a lot more evidence to say that we have free will if we're going to be punishing people because of this or something like that.
I didn't recognize that you were going to go in that direction with it. I thought you were going to say something along the lines of, in cases which there's not much riding on things like, hey, do you have free will to pick out if you're going to grab a beer or a water? Yeah. And so the stakes aren't really high in such situations. There, I'd probably bite the bullet and say, no, you might not have the evidence to say you need free will, because you don't really need that much evidence because it's a low stakes case. But yeah, in cases where we do have punishment, I think the stakes, it doesn't really play into their hand though, because if we let the person go, that's also high stakes as well, because they could, cause more harm to other individuals as well. So it kind of levels off. And given that the criminal justice system itself, I would argue, relies on a certain conception of freedom, to give it up, we wouldn't even be able to have a criminal justice system at all, I would say, without certain conceptions of it.
I want to come back to actually, maybe I'll let Matt come back to the issue of free will skepticism in a minute. But something you said a minute ago, I think is worth asking you a little bit more about. And that's the idea of like obligation depending on freedom. So some philosophers endorse a principle that's often called the ought implies can principle, which is roughly the idea that if a person's obligated to do something, then they're able to do it. They have to be able to do it in order to be obligated. If that's correct, it might seem like our having moral obligations requires having free will, which it sounds like you want to endorse. So do you think that kind of principle is right? And what else? Do you have any other thoughts on the idea of the principle that ought implies can?
Yeah, I'm glad you asked, because that's been a topic that I've been delving into now for, if I had to think about it, almost a decade, which is wow, it's a long time. But now that back when I was working with Ish Haji at the University of Calgary, one of the chapters that I was working on was about moral obligation and free will, and so there I delve right into the ought implies can principle, and I endorse it, and so. I do this a lot with my class as well. So making sure that I'm not on an island here because I'm endorsing this old school principle. I kind of give this case to the class. So let's see what you think. Let's say what you all think about this. So for me, I have them consider a case where an individual cannot use their arms or legs because they had a spine injury for the car accident. So it's a close friend of yours. And so your close friend who can't use his arms or legs, he's in a wheelchair, and, you go by to visit him, and he says, do you mind taking me out for some air? And you're like, yeah, no problem. So you push him in his wheelchair, and you go by the lake, and he asks for some free time by the edge of the lake, and you say, you just come back in 30 minutes for him. And you say, yeah, no problem. So you walk away. And so now your friend's at the edge of the lake in his wheelchair. He can't move his arms or legs. And in the distance, he sees a child. And so the child falls into the water. And so at this stage, I asked the class, how many of you believe that, now that you know that your friend can't use his arms or legs, how many people here believe that he's still obligated to jump in and save that child? And I've yet to have a student, and by, the amount of classes I teach a lot of students. So we're talking about 12 or 1300 students at this stage of the game. And not one person has said that they think that there's still an obligation there. Yeah. And so I take that to mean that there is a condition on obligation, that you have this ability. And now how that ability gets cashed out is obviously, the devil's in the details. But I believe that, and so Dirk Perboom talks about this in his 2014 Free Will, Agency and Meaning in Life. So I think Perboom recognizes that this is true as well. And so he tries to speak to it. And so he calls... he admits that not all obligations require this, though. And so he believes that there's this species of obligation. He calls it the ought of axiological recommendation. I think that's what he calls it. And he says that this survives in a world without free will. Mm-hmm. And he thinks that, we're able to use that ought in all these other, in like real life cases, so that we still get, a concept of the idea such that we can still kind of go on saying ought, you ought to do this or ought to do that. But I disagree with him. I think that the ought of axiological recommendation isn't the ought of agent-specific demand. It's not and so I think those agent-specific demands, we lose those. And I think those are moral obligations. The other oughts are just, there ought to be no racism in the world. Obviously, hopefully everyone agrees with that. But it's not saying specifically, there's no specific obligation that falls out of that recommendation. And so I think we lose a lot if we lose that. And I think that we need a very strong species of can to make sense of it.
Yeah. So maybe this is a nice way, or a good place to segue back to talking about free will skepticism. So given your view about how high the stakes are here, what do you think about the skeptical position that's going to disagree with you about this? Like, we've had Perboom and Caruso on the show, and they seemed pretty optimistic They both do. Yeah. So what do you say about the stakes that is at issue here between you and the skeptics?
So I've talked about this directly with, especially with Greg a lot. Dirk's been great. Every time I see Dirk at a conference, he's I'm a huge fan. I know his work, I think, better than any other philosopher probably. Because, it was just kind of funny because I have the opposite view. So it's really interesting to respect someone so much that you can disagree with so much.
Yeah.
He's such a really nice guy, and his memory is like no other. Like he'll remember a conversation I had with him 5 years ago and verbatim. But he and I will definitely disagree, and me and Caruso definitely disagree. I know this for sure. I spent many nights arguing back and forth with him at different conferences, and I've even hosted a couple times at Calvin. And so I think the basis of our disagreement lies in I think there's two kind of forms of disagreement. The first is that whether or not we have the free will. I think that we do, and I think that there's an epistemic argument to give to show that we do, and then that's based on the stakes. But beyond that, I think their optimism is miswarranted as well. And so, there's two questions: do we have free will? And then is it a good thing whether or not we have it? And I disagree with them on both of those on both of those fronts. And so, when Greg and I go back and forth, he kind of say we nod our heads in agreement because we're both incompatibilists. So there's lots of things that we are going to agree with. But where we disagree is on the details of whether or not we have it. And so it's kind of interesting to me how we can be in agreement all the way along. It's because we agree on the incompatibility. But I think the foundational disagreement is whether we have it or not. And I don't know if we have free will or not. But once you bring in the epistemic justification literature into the conversation, then it becomes an epistemic question on what we should believe. And given that both the skeptic and the libertarian, I believe, are on firm footing with regards to the plausibility of their views, then it becomes you have these two competing theories, and it becomes a question about, what the stakes are in that conversation. And if the stakes are high, I think all the worse for the free will skeptic. Now, on the flip side, the optimism, I also kind of agree with what they're saying there as well. I think that we take the free will stuff too far sometimes. We think that people can just pull themselves up from their bootstraps and, they should be able to do that, and we should hold them responsible otherwise. And so this is why we have, I think, punishment practices that are unjust and severe. And so I'm with them on all of that. But I think soon as you get rid of all of the free will, you don't have anything left to have a criminal justice system. And what is left is, I think, a more unjust system. So I think their optimism is also misguided with regards to punishment, because I think and I know Perboom and Caruso are really trying to work hard on this new quarantine model, but I just don't buy that model, because I think that it leaves us wide open to just, to egregious counterexamples. So for instance, when you're not backward looking at all and there's no desert base at all, well, why wouldn't we just go into random neighborhoods where there tends to be higher crime? And why don't we just take individuals that are in bad situations? Because in those bad situations, if there's a statistical significantly different kind of chance of them committing a crime, why don't we just take them from their homes and put them away before they commit the crimes? And under my view, it's pretty easy why that's wrong, because they don't deserve it, right? They didn't do anything wrong.
But on Minority Report kind of.
Yeah. And so I'm in much agreement with them. I think the criminal justice system needs to change. I think we overdo it sometimes with free will, but I think they're overdoing it. They're kind of throwing the baby out with the bathwater, so to speak. And what's left is not, unfortunately, it's not what they think it is. And so because of that, I just see that as raising the stakes even further in this debate.
Yeah. You just mentioned that you're an incompatibilist, so you agree with the skeptics like Caruso and Perboom about free will's incompatibility with determinism. I don't think I knew that, actually. I don't think I knew that you were an incompatibilist. So I was going to ask you, like, so John Fisher has argued that given free will's importance and centrality to our lives, like our conception of ourselves as morally responsible agents depends on free will and also shouldn't depend on whether determinism is true. So he takes that as a reason. It's a long story, but he takes that as a reason for preferring compatibilism over libertarianism. So so you don't agree, I take it, but you do think that the stakes here are important. The centrality of free will to our lives is important. So what do you think of that idea that, oh, maybe this is a reason to be a compatibilist?
If compatibilism gave us a, to quote Denny, a freedom worth wanting, then I'd be on board. I would be on board for accepting a compatibilist position. But unfortunately, I just don't see the freedom that's left in a compatibilist story to ground any of the practices that we currently have. So I agree with John that it's an important feature,
right?
But I also think truth matters as well. Mm-hmm. And so, yes, the stakes matter, but like, I shouldn't believe falsities just because it's a high stakes case either. And I would have to believe a falsity, I think, to think that the compatibilist understanding of freedom gets us the things that are central to our lives.
Yeah, that makes sense.
So yeah, so I want to believe John, but like I've had some interactions with him actually just recently. We're in agreement on he's coming out with this defense of retributivism. And I'm coming, I guess he read an interview of mine for the What's It Like to Be a Philosopher website. Yeah. And he contacted me. He said, hey, I at the end of that interview, I mentioned I was working on this paper. And so we've gone back and forth about his view there. And we're in agreement on that retributivism, but, and I'm in agreement with him on lots of other things as well. He's great. But I can't get on board with the semi-compatibilism. It just doesn't. It doesn't really ground things for me at all. And so, unfortunately, I just think he's misguided there.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So what would be your view? Like you have this view called reasonable retributivism. Can you contrast that with, I don't know if you want to call it an unreasonable retributivism or regular retributivism?
Yeah.
If John's listening, don't tell him. We shouldn't tell him we're calling his view unreasonable.
No, so I actually think John is in my camp. Right?
Okay.
And so I think he's developing, and the view that he's developing is reasonable. It's on the reasonable end of things. And what I mean by that is, I think there's two central questions in the punishment debate. Who should we punish? Or let's put it this way. Why do we punish? And who are we going to punish? And how should we punish? And I think unreasonable retributivism tries to answer both of those questions with desert. I believe we should only be answering one of those questions with desert. So who we should punish and why we should punish, that's a question of desert. Because you did X. Because that's why you deserve to be punished. And that punishment, what that punishment should look like, is a separate question.
Yeah.
And so once you recognize that those two questions are distinct, and you don't answer the second question with desert, then I believe we get exactly what we need out of a punishment system. We're punishing the right people, and how we punish, well, I think that's mostly forward-looking, because those individuals, more often than not, are released into society. So those are forward-looking reasons, because we're developing the character of these individuals. And so we should develop it in a way that's going to have them produce and contribute to society, because we want to have contributing members and for their own sake, so that they can have more meaningful relationships. And so once you see that two separate questions, then you're going to want a more compassionate punishment system, but you're still going to want to make sure that those individuals are punished. Because again, desert's doing a lot of work in our criminal justice system. The victims don't deserve to see that person at the shopping mall the day after it happens. And those individuals, we owe it to them to make sure that they're in a position to have a flourishing life afterwards. And so I think once you kind of separate the two questions, then we get a reasonable retributivism, one where we're not overly focused on desert such that it impacts the way that we do punish instead of just impacting who we should punish.
Yeah.
You mentioned forward-looking reasons. Do you also think that there's backward-looking reasons?
So yeah, so I think that that's the whole basis of punishment is backward-looking. So like who we should punish and why we're punishing is always backward-looking. And so when I'm looking for the culprit, I'm looking for someone who did X. And so there's always a backward-looking element. Whereas, you know, the Carusos of the world and, you know, in Dirk a little bit, well, not Dirk a little bit, I guess Dirk as well, they're both trying to give a completely forward-looking account.
Yeah.
But then why are they picking that person rather than person B? Because that in itself is backward-looking as far as I'm concerned. And so if it was purely forward-looking, you would just look at brain scans of individuals and just start plucking people out, regardless of what they've done. And so I feel like they're committed to, you know, kind of like a Minority Report type criminal justice system. And I think they're committed to it because they just want to forward look and they don't get this dessert. They want to have their cake and eat it too, but I'm not so sure that they can do that.
Would the backward looking reasons also apply even if the forward looking reasons don't pan out? So like part of the forward looking reasons is to adjust their character so they can be contributing members of society in the future. Sometimes there are people who say, well, no, like those people deserve to be punished even if no rehabilitation happens.
Yeah, so I feel like it's a tough question because I do believe that these individuals should be punished for what they've done, right? And I believe in a backward-looking sense. But I feel like we overdo it in the backward-looking sense a lot. And we let that kind of overwhelm the forward-looking reasons, which I think are more important when it comes to how we punish. And so I think it's a mixed bag. I think that you definitely have to be backward-looking because how much time should they get? What they owe to the victims? I think those questions are always relevant to what the forward-looking approach is going to look like, but they're just relevant. They shouldn't be the end-all, be-all of what that forward-looking approach looks like. They shouldn't always trump the forward-looking reasons. And so, you know, someone who kills someone versus someone who assaults someone, you know, I think that what they actually did is going to play a part in how long we restrict their freedoms. Mm-hmm. But as far as I'm concerned, you know, the forward-looking reasons should always trump those backward-looking reasons. So what I mean by always trump, I mean, maybe 15 years for the killer, but 15 years of purely rehabilitative, teaching these individuals, teaching them how to flourish if they ever get the chance to get out. Those kinds of things is what the punishment process should look like, but just for a longer period of time because those victims deserve to not have to run into that person and they deserve a certain kind of peace that punishment gives to the victims. So for me, punishment is just as much about the victim as it is about the individual. But so the amount of time you give the individual, that would be about the victim. And the kind of punishment you give them would be about the individual. It should be curtailed to the needs that they have and what's missing from their cognitive apparatus, such that the punishment should look a little bit differently depending on those concerns. I don't know if that was a case.
Yeah.
That's fascinating. I guess if you had a case where two people did the same sort of behavior, but one, let's say, satisfied some mens rea requirement and the other didn't, but you have the same sort of forward-looking considerations at play in both cases, like it would help both of them if you helped rehabilitate, helped form their characters so that after some, maybe punitive treatment, they would do better, they would flourish in society. Do you think there's a difference in that sort of case and how we should treat them? it looks like in both cases, like the who we should treat is it's going to be the same, and it's based on this backward-looking fact, not about moral responsibility if we take mens rea to be associated with that, but about maybe like causal responsibility. But one of them is, let's say, blameworthy, and the other maybe isn't. So I'm wondering if that, in that kind of case, if backward-looking deserved blame is going to play a role or not.
That's a great question, Taylor. And so when you initially started the question, I was thinking about cases such as individuals who might have a mental illness and how we treat them. So we already treat them differently. We put them into a different kind of place. And I think we put them in a different kind of place because they need different kind of treatment. Yeah. But as far as blame is concerned, I think that the person who is morally responsible is going to need more punishment. And so by more, I just mean there's an added thing we're punishing them for. And so once you add that in, I think that might be able to justify a longer stretch of time, even though the kind of treatment is going to be the same. Mm-hmm. And so if we figured that, a certain kind of moral development, so they have us go in there and they teach them ethics or something like that, and they can go into the community, but they have to be back there at the end of the evening. They can't get out on weekends. Whatever that looks like, I think it should probably be the same, but the person who's morally responsible would have an added amount of time because there's more that they have to learn, arguably. And so it might be backward looking. I hope that it is. I think that it is. Because if it's not, then I think that this approach could be utilized by the Carusos of the world. So that's a great question.
Can I ask another question about a different thing you're working on that you're interested in, the epistemic condition on moral responsibility? I know you've done some work on this and have some thoughts, and we've had an episode where we interviewed Dan Miller, kind of introducing the epistemic condition and talking about how tracing can work in cases where someone seems like they're non-culpably ignorant. But tell us a little bit about what you're interested in connected with the epistemic condition.
Yeah, so Neil's work on this has really made me think a lot about the epistemic condition. And so Neil, if I understand him correctly, he's almost combining the epistemic condition with the freedom condition. And so I find that I like that move. Mm-hmm. Now,
this is Neil Levy you're talking about?
Yeah, Neil Levy. Yeah. And so I think there's something to that in the sense that to be free, you need to know what you're doing in a sense. And he kind of builds that right in. And so for me, I think that's right. Mm-hmm. And so maybe you could say more about specifically what you want me to talk about with regards to the epistemic condition. So is it the problem with tracing? What specifically is the issue you wanna chat? Because I think it should be combined with the freedom condition. I think talking about them separately kind of confuses the conversation a little bit. Which is, I know that's not, the literature says otherwise, but
I think I'm on board actually. One time, I think it's in like a 2010 paper, Al Mealy says something about a case where, and I think the case might be from like Fisher and Revisa or something like that. But imagine someone backs their truck out of their driveway, and unbeknownst to them, there's a kitten snoozing underneath one of their tires, and like they had no reason to expect there would be a cat there. They don't have a cat. Normally they check, and they did in this case. Like they looked around, they didn't see anything. They thought they could just back out of their park, their driveway as normal. Does the person freely run over the kitten? It seems odd to say yes, and it's because they don't know that the kitten's there. It doesn't seem like they're freely doing that. So I think that kind of case is pretty convincing to me that maybe there is some kind of epistemic component to the freedom condition. But yeah, why don't you say a little bit more? Are you motivated by that kind of case or something else?
Yeah, no, that's exactly right. And so I don't remember if I read that case or if Ish Haji brought that case up in conversation. And it's, it's about a decade ago. So it's all kind of like combined at this point for me. But, but yeah, it's those kind of cases that I'm thinking about where it's like, yeah, I freely back the car up, but like you're stopping the conversation short. Like we need to talk about all the elements to know if I freely did that thing.
Mm-hmm.
And so one of the elements is kind of the metaphysical question about, how actions come about. And I think that's important. But I think equally important is the epistemic component, in that if I had knowledge of what I was doing, then only then can I act freely. Otherwise, I'm just flailing around. And so the second that you bring in the epistemic component, I think it's always present in all of these conversations. And so without it, that doesn't sound like a free action to me at all. And so I've never been one to want to separate them, though I see the motivation to do so, because it's, how much knowledge do you need seems to be a separate question from what the freedom actually is. But I think once you kind of start talking about the cases and really digging in for years on this stuff, they kind of just come together. And so I think it's Neil, and I'm not sure exactly what paper he does this in, or maybe it was in conversation, but he just combines the two, and it might even be in his Moral Luck book, the book on luck, where he talks about this. But yeah, I'm convinced that there's just that component to it, and that's just what it means to be free, is to have a certain you've met an epistemic bar to even be acting, even, because again, otherwise I'm just flailing around without any knowledge, and that doesn't seem like free at all. It just seems like movement.
Yeah. I remember Al telling another story about a guy who shot an intruder in his house who was masked. And it just so happens that the intruder was his son, who happened to be coming home from a costume party or something. I don't remember the details of the case. And then the question is, well, does he freely shoot his son? Right. And it seems like he doesn't freely shoot his son. He freely shot somebody, but he doesn't, because he doesn't know it's his son.
Exactly. Yeah, it's another great case. I worked with, before I went to Calgary, I was at Washington State University when I did my master's, and I was there with Joe Campbell. And so he's pretty much the person who I really started digging into the literature with. And so he introduced me to like Keith Lear and Mark Balaguer and a few other visitors he had over at Washington State. And he actually is the person who recommended that I work with Ish Haji up in Calgary. And so I think Campbell also came up with a bunch of these cases as well. Yeah. And so again, maybe it's Campbell that I'm thinking of and not Levy, but I think if we ask them all, I think they're all going to agree with us as well. I think once you've kind of been digging in long enough, it sounds weird to say you're freely doing something if you had no knowledge about the details. And so because those details matter to the moral responsibility of the question. And given that most of us only care about free will because of the things that it's connected to, then I think you're going to be more inclined to think that those questions kind of are conflated. But unless you're someone who just wonders about the metaphysics of the world, and I wonder how these things really, then you might just care about the freedom condition and not the epistemic condition. But if you care about practical philosophy, and I think most of us get into philosophy because we want to live better. And so I think most of us are going to, be on board with this connection, I think.
Yeah, it kind of strikes me as interesting that the people who tend to say that the freedom and epistemic conditions go together tend to be people with more of a background in action theory and are interested in like intentional agency. Like Al Mealy's a great example of this. And it does seem like to intentionally run over the kitten or shoot your son, there is a kind of epistemic component that's not satisfied in these cases. But then if you're thinking of just like, metaphysical freedom or like the freedom to avoid doing something, well, yeah, sure, I could have avoided backing the car up over the kitten, but I just didn't know that like that was a salient option. That's just the way the world was. So if you're coming from that kind of angle on to the free will debate, I could see thinking about the conditions as really separate.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, no, that's a great sociological point in the literature. I think that's right. Randy Clark is another one. He talks like, I think he it's kind of interesting to kind of see the individuals, like the other philosophical interests that they have, and kind of putting together like their approach to the free will problem. Once you kind of have that background and you know kind of what they're into, so to speak, philosophically, it just makes you nod your head and like, oh, okay, that's why you're seeing it this way. That's why you're understanding it this way. It's a really interesting sociological kind of point that I feel like you only can really appreciate when you've been in the literature for so long, and you get to know these philosophers and you get to know their projects, that you start to kind of see these common threads that, I don't know, there's probably a paper to be had about that, the sociology of free will with regards to interesting to me.
Fascinating.
Fascinating.
It would be. Yeah.
Cool. Well, thanks so much for joining us, Justin, and for letting us ask you about so many different aspects of your work. This has been awesome. If listeners want to follow up and see more of the things you're working on, where can they go to find your work?
Good question. I guess my website would be the best place. My website is www.profjustincauette.com. Don't ask me why I put Prof. Justin Caouette.
I like it.
That was when I was in grad school. I think it was a first year grad student. I was trying to be professional, and so it just stuck. So yeah, that's the best.
So the prof is for professional.
Yeah.
We'll link that in the show notes in case people don't know how many vowels go in your name too.
Yeah.
Everyone in a row as well.
That's right.
Yeah. Thanks, Justin.
All right. Thanks, guys. It's been fun.
In our next episode, our guest will be John Mayer, therapist and academic philosopher based in Cambridge, Massachusetts.